My name is Arthur Reed, and the words that shattered me came not from a stranger, but from my own son. You have no meaning in this house anymore. Imagine hearing that in the very living room you built with your own hands, with the woman you once loved. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply stood in silence because silence can be sharper than any blade. What they didn't know was that the very papers they wanted me to sign would become the trap that exposed them. And when the storm finally came, it wasn't me who collapsed. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more stories that will stay with you long after they're told. You have no meaning in this house anymore. Those words did not come from an enemy across a battlefield or a rival in business. They came from my son, Caleb, sitting across from me in the living room I had once sanded and painted with my own hands. He spoke them without anger, almost like a line he had rehearsed. His voice was calm, deliberate, and heavy enough to shake the ground beneath my feet. I sat there staring at the same floorboards I had bent over 30 years earlier, with Ruth by my side sanding away the splinters so our boy would never trip. Now the same boy grown into a man was erasing me one sentence at a time. Mara, my daughter-in-law, shifted her weight on the couch, crossing her legs, with the kind of polished confidence that comes only when someone believes the game is already won. She smiled, polite but satisfied, and placed a folder on the coffee table. Its edges were sharp against the glossy magazines she had laid beneath it, as though the whole scene had been staged. My eyes lingered on that folder the way a hunter watches for movement at the edge of the trees. I didn't need to open it to know what it held. Paperwork is the most efficient weapon for people who want to look righteous while cutting you out. I wanted to ask Caleb if this was truly his voice, or if Mara's hand was pushing from behind. But instead I kept silent. Silence, I've learned, has a weight of its own. The hum of the refrigerator down the hall filled the room steadier than any heartbeat. Mara broke the stillness with a voice smooth as butter. Arthur, we don't want this to be dramatic. It's just time for better arrangements. She used the word arrangements as though she were planning a vacation, not evicting a father from his own house. I looked at my son. His eyes were fixed on a framed map of Lake Superior we had hung last spring. His jaw clenched, his hands resting too neatly on his knees. He couldn't even face me. "Dad," he said finally, "we've talked about this. Since Mom passed, things have been different. We found a good place for you, community living meals activities. You'll have your own space." He said it like a salesman reciting lines. But I heard the quiver at the edge of his voice. My hand trembled slightly as I touched the leather strap of my old watch, its brass buckle faintly engraved with my father's initials. That watch had measured every hour of Caleb's life, from the night I drove him around the block as an infant until he fell asleep to the day he called me from college after landing his first internship. And now it was ticking in my ear as he pushed me out. I asked quietly, "What happens to my room?" My tools, Mara was quick to answer. "We made space in the garage. Caleb cleared a shelf, and Gary can handle the truck. The truck, my F-150. My pulse quickened, but I kept my face still. It was then I noticed the yellow post-it on the folder, Notary 7:00 p.m. The decision had already been made, the signatures already scheduled. This wasn't a conversation. It was an execution. The folder sat between us like a loaded weapon. Caleb didn't touch it, but Mara leaned forward, her manicured nails brushing the edge as though to remind me it was hers to open. "Arthur," she said with that polished tone she always used when speaking to people she thought beneath her, "this is just housekeeping. A few signatures to make sure things run smoothly." Housekeeping. That word lodged in my chest like a splinter. I had spent decades fixing leaking roofs, patching cracked plaster, paying bills on time, so Caleb would never grow up worrying about whether the lights would stay on. Now they wanted to call my erasure housekeeping. I reached for the folder slowly, my hand steadying on the armrest of my chair. Mara smiled too quickly. "We'll go through it together." Caleb cleared his schedule for tonight. Her words were silk, but the steel glimmered underneath. The first page was a power of attorney broad sweeping, written in dense paragraphs of legal language. "So we can act fast if you need help," Mara explained before I even asked. Her eyes flicked to Caleb for support, but he stayed fixed on that map of Lake Superior. He looked like a man watching a storm form on the horizon, powerless to stop it. I didn't respond. I kept turning pages. The next was a quitclaim deed, my name pre-printed, waiting for ink to erase me. There it was, sitting quietly in the corner of the document like a fox crouching at the edge of the field, quitclaim. Not bold, not loud, just patient, waiting for the unsuspecting to sign. "What about this one?" I asked, calmly tapping the edge of the paper. Caleb cleared his throat. "It just simplifies things, Dad. Since you co-signed on the refinance, this removes complications. Makes bills easier." Mara added, "It's just efficiency. We don't want to bother you with paperwork." Efficiency. That was another word people use when they want to bury you politely. I looked at Caleb. For a split second, his mask slipped, and I saw the boy who once came home crying after failing his driver's test. He hated paperwork back then, too. I helped him through it line by line until he could face it again. Now here he was pushing papers at me, not to build a future, but to erase a past. I laid the folder back on the table, closed, and leaned back. "I don't sign anything I haven't read carefully," I said. Mara's smile faltered. "We'll read them together, line by line." She tried to recover, but her voice tightened at the edges. That was when I noticed the small yellow post-it note tucked deeper inside the folder. It wasn't meant for me to see, but years in the plant had trained me to catch details others missed. The words were scrawled in hurried black ink, Notary 7:00 p.m. My heart didn't race. It slowed. They weren't asking, they were staging. A notary was already scheduled, ready to make my absence official. They had rehearsed this down to the minute. I folded my hands, the watch on my wrist ticking louder in my ears than the refrigerator's hum. They thought silence meant surrender. But to me, silence was a tool, and tonight I would use it. The yellow note burned in my mind. Notary 7:00 p.m. It wasn't an invitation. It was a sentence, and I was supposed to be the man led quietly to the gallows. Mara leaned back into the couch, her legs crossed like a queen overseeing a ceremony. Caleb stayed silent, his jaw set, but his eyes drifting everywhere except toward me. "Dad," he began, his voice low. "Let's just keep this adult. We've run the numbers. Groceries, electricity, subscriptions you don't use. We're covering everything. It isn't healthy to keep going like this." His words were clipped, rehearsed like a speech delivered at work. He didn't see me as a father anymore. He saw me as an expense. I tapped the edge of the folder gently, letting the sound echo in the room. "What happens to my truck?" I asked. Mara didn't hesitate. "It's old Arthur. Not safe for you to drive something that size anymore. Gary might give us something for it." She said it like she was talking about a piece of broken furniture, not the truck that had carried Caleb home from the hospital as a newborn. The words "no meaning" didn't just bruise. They rearranged the entire house around me. I felt as though the walls had shifted, the air had tilted. This wasn't a family discussion. This was an eviction masked as concern. I let out a breath and said softly, "Let's not decide everything tonight." Mara's lips curled into a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. We already found a spot, Arthur. They're holding it for you because Caleb explained your situation. They can take you Monday. Monday. 3 days away. In their minds, the door had already closed on me. I picked up the glass of water I had poured earlier and took a slow sip. The copper tang of old pipes filled my mouth. That taste grounded me, reminded me that silence could be sharper than any protest. I stood cane steady against the floor and walked toward the kitchen. Caleb half rose, uncertain, but I waved him down. "I'm just thirsty," I said, and disappeared behind the doorway. In the kitchen, I stared at the clock above the stove. Its green numbers glowed back at me, 5:01 p.m. 2 hours until the notary arrived with his stamp and scanner ready to erase me from my own house. I tightened my grip on the counter, the cool laminate pressing into my palms. That was when I remembered the file cabinet in my closet. Tucked behind a folded blanket were the documents no one here had thought about for years. Birth certificates, tax returns, promissory notes, and one piece of paper that mattered most, the lien I had placed when Caleb first bought this house. Quiet, legal binding. I turned back to the living room, glass still in my hand, and lowered myself into the chair again. Caleb glanced at me nervously. Mara smoothed the folder as if nothing had happened. They thought I would read, nod, and wait like a lamb for the notary. But they didn't know that I already held a piece of paper stronger than anything in their folder. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the house like a judge's gavel. Mara stood quickly smoothing her skirt as if preparing for a performance. Caleb hesitated, then followed her, his shoulders squared but stiff. I stayed seated, cane resting against my knee hands, folded on top of the folder they thought belonged to them. The notary was a middle-aged man with a neat beard and the smell of wintergreen gum clinging to him. His leather case bulged with tools of his trade stamp journal ID scanner, all gleaming with quiet authority. "Evening," he said cheerfully. "Let's make this quick." He looked at me. "You must be Arthur." "I must," I replied evenly. He chuckled, not realizing the weight of the exchange. Mara ushered him in with the energy of someone who believes the finish line is already crossed. She gestured toward the dining table where pens were lined up like silverware beside the folder. "We're ready," she said brightly. Caleb added, "Dad, it's just signatures. Nothing complicated." I leaned on my cane, rose slowly, and walked to the table. My watch ticked in my ear louder than the hum of the refrigerator. I pulled out a chair and sat, laying the watch down beside the peppermint bowl they'd set for decoration. "Before we sign," I said calmly, "we read." The notary nodded. "That's how I prefer to do it. Out loud, so there's no confusion." Mara's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Of course." And so we began. The words on the page, once silent, gained weight as they were spoken aloud. Durable power of attorney. Jointly and severally. Healthcare directive. Each phrase rolled through the room like stones dropped into water. Caleb shifted uneasily, glancing at Mara, but she kept her eyes fixed on the notary's pen. When we reached the quitclaim deed, I tapped the margin with my index finger. "This one removes my name from the title entirely," I said. Caleb cleared his throat. "It just makes things easier, Dad. Bill's refinancing. It makes things easier for you." I interrupted, my tone still calm but firm. "It makes me invisible." The notary's pen hovered above the page, but I shook my head. "I won't be signing this tonight." Mara's composure cracked. "Arthur, this is exactly the kind of manipulation. It's a boundary," I said, looking her square in the eye. "Boundaries are what families draw when respect runs out." The notary coughed gently into his hand. "Happens all the time," he said. "If you're not ready, we can reschedule. No fee." "Thank you," I said, sliding the folder toward me. "I'll keep this." We'll try again when this conversation begins with truth. Caleb's face fell. Mara's eyes burned. The notary zipped up his case, polite but uneasy. And as he left, I thought of Ruth's words. You don't have to shout to raise the stakes. They had expected a signature. Instead, I gave them silence that cut deeper than any pen could. When the notary's car pulled away, its taillights disappearing down the street, the house fell into a silence so sharp it almost rang in my ears. Mara stalked back into the dining room, her heels clicking against the wood like hammers on nails. Caleb trailed behind her. His head bowed, shoulders hunched, the look of a man who thought he'd already won, only to find out the game had barely begun. "Dad," he said quietly, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder for who I asked." My voice was steady, calm, but the question hung heavy in the room. Caleb didn't answer. He sat down, burying his face in his hands as if trying to block out the weight of his own choices. Mara, though, wasn't the type to retreat. "Arthur," she said, her tone clipped, "this is for your own good. We can't keep living like this. You don't contribute, and emotionally—" She stopped herself, realizing the word was a knife too sharp to finish. "It's not healthy," she added quickly. I leaned forward, tapping the folder with one finger. Healthy families don't schedule a notary before having a conversation. Healthy families don't slip brochures under doors like eviction notices. If you want to talk about health, Mara, start there. Her cheeks flushed crimson. Caleb lifted his head, his eyes darting between us, but he said nothing. I stood slowly, cane steady against the floor, and picked up the folder. "I'll keep this tonight. We'll revisit it tomorrow." Mara's lips parted, fury boiling just beneath her polished smile, but she stayed silent. Caleb gave a small nod, almost grateful for the pause, though he wouldn't admit it. Back in my room, I set the folder on Ruth's old desk and laid my watch on top of it, the tick steady as a heartbeat. I pulled open the drawer and took out the green notebook with the words, "After Ruth," scrawled on the cover. Tonight's entry was short. They scheduled a notary. They rehearsed my erasure. They think silence means surrender. They don't know silence can mean strategy. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling plaster. Ruth used to say that patience was a form of power. She was right. They had played their move. Now it was my turn. The next morning, I dressed neatly, buttoned a clean shirt, and walked into the kitchen, where Mara was already stirring sugar into her coffee. She looked up, startled by my composure. "Morning, Arthur," she said too brightly. Caleb sat at the table, his spoon clinking nervously against his cereal bowl. I poured myself coffee without asking, let the silence stretch, then said evenly, "I kept the lien from when you bought this house." Caleb froze, spoon suspended midair. Mara's smile faltered. "What lien?" she asked too quickly. "The one from the down payment," I said. "Paper doesn't age like people. It stays fresh." The silence that followed was deeper than anything from the night before. For the first time, I saw real fear flicker in Mara's eyes. They thought they had trapped me, but the trap was already theirs. "You kept what?" Mara's voice cracked, her polished confidence slipping for the first time. Caleb dropped his spoon, milk splattering across the table, his eyes wide with something between confusion and shame. I let the silence settle before repeating it clearly. "The lien from when you bought this house. 40% of the down payment came from me, and I made sure it was recorded." Caleb leaned back in his chair, his face pale. Mara tried to recover, but her words stumbled. "Arthur, that can't still be valid. That was years ago. Paperwork expires, doesn't it?" She looked at Caleb for reassurance, but he couldn't meet her gaze. He knew better. I took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness sharp but grounding. Paper doesn't age like people. It stays fresh until someone tears it up and no one has. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. I could feel the air tighten, the balance of power shifting like sand under their feet. Mara's jaw worked as though she wanted to argue, but nothing came. Caleb rubbed his temples, muttering, "Why didn't you tell us? Because you never asked," I said simply. I placed my cup gently on the coaster I had carved from the old maple tree years ago. The act was deliberate, almost ceremonial. You wanted efficiency. You wanted to erase me quietly. But efficiency works both ways. I stood Cain tapping against the floor and added, "I have errands today." Neither of them asked where. That was their first mistake. They assumed I would retreat, lick my wounds, maybe sulk like a man out of options. Instead, I stepped into the crisp autumn air, my jacket buttoned, the green notebook tucked in my pocket like a shield. At the bakery, Mrs. Jensen greeted me with her usual warmth. "Arthur, haven't seen you in a while." "How's Caleb treating you?" she asked lightly. I smiled faintly. "Like a guest in my own house," I said, letting the words drop just heavy enough to stir her concern. Her brow furrowed, and she pressed the loaf of rye into my hands with a touch more care than usual. Seeds don't need speeches. They only need whispers in the right ears. From there, I walked to the hardware store. Old Tom behind the counter looked up surprised. "Arthur, need more nails." "Not nails," I said. "Just sandpaper for Ruth's desk. I thought I'd smooth the edges." He chuckled. "Still fixing things, huh?" I looked him in the eye. "Better to fix wood than family." His smile faltered. Another seed planted. By the time I reached the post office, I heard my name whispered between two neighbors waiting in line. "Arthur's son," pushing him out, one said softly. I didn't correct them. Rumors grow faster when left to breathe on their own. As I walked home, the leaves crunched beneath my feet like a rhythm keeping time. Patience, Ruth had once told me, was a form of power. They thought I was powerless. But today, I had set the first stones rolling. And by the time they realized it, the landslide would already be coming down the mountain. By the time I reached the law office on Main Street, the town was already buzzing. Small towns don't keep secrets. Every whisper echoes louder than any shout. The sign above the door read, "Reed and Associates, faded from years of sun, but still steady." My younger brother Daniel had practiced here for decades. He wasn't expecting me, but when I walked in with my cane tapping against the floor, his eyes lit up with surprise. "Art," he said, coming around the desk, "what brings you here?" I lowered myself into the chair across from him, setting my green notebook on the table like a soldier laying down a weapon. "I need advice." I said, my voice low, "and I need it to stay between us." The smile drained from his face. He knew when a man wasn't joking. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. I laid it out carefully, piece by piece, the cold words from Caleb. The folder Mara presented the notary scheduled without my consent. The Silver Pines brochure slipped under my door. I told him about the lien I had kept alive, the whispers I had already sown at the bakery, the hardware store, the post office. I spoke like a man assembling tools on a workbench, each one sharp, each one ready. When I finished, Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Jesus, Art, your boy. They don't know what they've stepped into. They think I'm too tired to fight," I said. "But I don't need to fight. I need to remember." He pulled out a yellow legal pad, tapping his pen thoughtfully. "That lien, if it's still active, and from what you're saying it is, they can't refinance, can't sell, can't even list the house without your consent. They're trapped unless you let them out." I nodded. "That's the point. but I want them to feel it. I want them to understand that trust isn't a signature you squeeze out of someone, it's earned. Daniel scribbled a note, then looked up. We can draft a notice, quiet but firm. If they try anything at the bank, the lien will stop them cold. And if they push, I can file an injunction. They won't move an inch without you. Not yet, I said. Let them believe they've won first. Then we'll remind them whose name still matters. For a moment his eyes softened. You always were the patient one, he said. I almost smiled. Patience isn't waiting quietly. It's sharpening quietly. We shook hands, his grip firm, his eyes carrying both promise and blood. When I stepped back out into the cool air, I felt the steadiness of a man who had spent his life reading blueprints and schematics. You don't need to shout when you've already measured the beams holding up the house. Walking home, I thought of Ruth. She used to say, Art, you never raise your voice. You raise the stakes. She was right. And tonight, Mara and Caleb would begin to realize the stakes had already changed. The next morning, I rose before dawn, the air sharp against my lungs. I buttoned my flannel shirt, slipped my green notebook into my jacket pocket, and stepped outside. Some men carry weapons into battle. I carried paper. But I knew I needed more than paper. I needed a living ally, someone who remembered who I was before Mara's polite smiles and Caleb's quiet betrayal. The VFW hall was the same as it had been for 40 years. The scent of burnt coffee and old wood polish clung to the walls like memory. Inside, I found Frank Lawson leaning back in a chair cap, tilted low, nursing a mug of black coffee. His hair was whiter now, but his eyes were as steady as they had been when we worked side by side at the plant. Art, he said with a grin, I'll be damned. Haven't seen you in months. Sit. I lowered myself into the chair across from him, the boards creaking beneath our combined weight. For a moment, we just looked at each other, two relics from another era, scarred, but unbroken. Finally, I said, Frank, I need a favor. His smile faded, replaced by the seriousness of a man who knew favors between old friends were never small. What's going on? So I told him. Not all at once, not rushed, but carefully, like tightening bolts on a machine one by one. Caleb's words. Mara's folder, the notary appointment, the Silver Pines brochure slipped under my door, the lien they'd forgotten, and the whispers already spreading around town. Through it all, Frank listened, jaw tightening his hand, clenching the mug. When I finished, he shook his head. Jesus, Art, your boy. He let the words trail off heavy in the stale air. I nodded. My boy. Frank leaned forward. What do you need? Because if it's fists, I'm too old. But if it's eyes, ears, maybe a hand or two, I've still got plenty of that. I felt my throat tighten, not with weakness, but with the reminder that loyalty still lived in this world. I reached across the table, gripping his hand. His handshake was firm, steady, the same as it had been 30 years ago on the line. You vouched for my boy when no one else would, Frank said quietly. This is nothing compared to that. You've got me. We talked for an hour, laying out the pieces. Frank mentioned his cousin at the county clerk's office, the very place where deeds and titles passed through like currency. She can keep you updated, he said. If anyone files something under your name, she'll let me know. Off the record. I nodded slowly. That would help. And my nephew's in real estate, he added. If Mara's been sniffing around about listing, he'll hear it before anyone else. Gossip in that world moves fast. It struck me then how little they understood. Mara and Caleb thought they could maneuver quietly, that I was too frail to keep up. They didn't know that small towns don't keep secrets, and that I had friends whose loyalty ran deeper than any marriage certificate. When I left the hall, the morning sun was breaking through the clouds, casting light across the wet pavement. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was walking alone. Back home, Mara was on the phone, her voice sharp, whispering into the receiver. "Yes, Friday. He'll sign by then. Don't worry." She caught herself when she saw me pasting on a bright smile. "Just the plumber," she said too quickly. I gave her a thin smile. "Funny. Pipes haven't leaked once." Her face tightened, another crack in the mask. And I knew then the trap was closing, but not on me. That evening the house was thick with unease. Caleb paced the living room, his phone in his hand, staring at the dark screen as if it might deliver a miracle. Mara sat stiffly on the couch, her back straight. Her eyes narrowed at me like she was daring me to speak first. I didn't. I let silence fill the room. Silence is heavier than anger. It forces people to carry their own thoughts. Finally, Caleb broke. "Dad, we need to finalize this. Mara's been working so hard on these arrangements. You're making it harder." His voice faltered on the last word. "Harder for who?" I asked, my tone low but steady. His lips pressed tight as if the question itself accused him of something he didn't want to face. Mara jumped in. "Arthur, this isn't about us. It's about you. It's about making sure you're cared for. That facility offers everything: meals, medical support, community. You'll thank us one day." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cane. You don't schedule a notary behind a man's back if you're offering him care. You do that when you're taking control. Her face flushed, but she forced a smile. "You're twisting it." "No," I said, my voice calm. "I'm untwisting it." Caleb turned away, staring at the map of Lake Superior on the wall. For a moment, his shoulders slumped, and I saw the boy he had once been, the boy who used to stand at the end of our gravel driveway, with a baseball glove too big for his hand, waving it like a flag, until I came home from work to play catch. That boy wanted nothing more than to hear me say, "Again, son. Again." But the man standing in my living room now was letting his wife write a script where his father no longer existed. "Do you remember," I said quietly, "when you failed your driver's test?" Caleb turned, startled. "You came home embarrassed, ready to hide it. And I told you, failure only stings when you hide it. The next week, you went back and passed." He blinked, caught between memory and shame. Mara cut in sharply. "Arthur, this has nothing to do with the past. We're talking about the future." "The past," I said, "is the foundation of the future. You can't build a house by tearing out its footings. Try it, and the whole thing collapses." The silence that followed was thicker than before. Caleb rubbed his forehead, muttering, "I don't know what to do." His voice was barely audible, but I heard it. It was the first crack in the wall Mara had built around him. I leaned back, tapping my watch gently against the table. Then do nothing. Sometimes that's the wisest choice. Mara shot me a look sharp enough to cut glass, but she didn't speak. She grabbed Caleb's arm and pulled him toward the stairs, whispering furiously as they climbed. I didn't catch the words, but I didn't need to. The distance in his footsteps told me enough. When the house fell quiet, I returned to my desk and opened the green notebook. Tonight's entry was simple: Caleb is cracking. Mara is pressing harder. The storm is close, and silence is teaching faster than words ever could. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee while the house settled around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the third stair, even the faint tick of my watch, each sound reminded me that the house itself was on my side. Mara walked in, her smile tight, her phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. Caleb trailed behind her, silent, his eyes avoiding mine. They thought I was still cornered, but they didn't know that the circle outside our walls had already started to close. By noon, I walked into town. The bakery was busier than usual, and I felt eyes following me as I ordered a loaf of rye. Mrs. Jensen leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. "Arthur, people are talking. Some say Caleb's trying to sell the house without you." Her eyes searched mine for confirmation. I didn't nod. I didn't deny. I only said sons forget. Sometimes fathers remember. The words spread faster than any signature ever could. At the hardware store, Tom asked too many questions. "Arthur, you fixing something big," he said, as I bought more sandpaper. I shrugged. Sometimes it's not wood that needs smoothing. His brow furrowed, and I knew the seed had landed. That afternoon, I stopped at Frank's place. He was waiting on his porch pipe, smoke curling in the crisp air. "Art," he said, "my cousin at the clerk's office called. Mara came in yesterday asking about transferring the deed. She left angry when they told her she couldn't access anything without you." He grinned, shaking his head. "She's pushing hard, but the wall's solid." I nodded, steady. "Good. Let her push. The harder she leans, the louder the cracks will sound." "And my nephew heard from a realtor friend," Frank added. "She's been asking about listings timelines, fast sales. She's already trying to move the house." I exhaled slowly, not with fear, but with certainty. Let her try. The lean will stop her cold. Frank studied me. "You've still got people in your corner, Art. Don't forget that." Back home, Mara was pacing the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, Friday. Don't worry, he'll sign by then. He's too tired to fight." Her words slipped through the air like knives. When she saw me, she quickly added, "Oh, hi, Arthur, just talking to the plumber." I leaned on my cane, meeting her eyes. "Pipes haven't leaked in years," I said. Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't answer. Later that night, I opened my green notebook and wrote "Seeds planted." Mara nervous, Caleb silent, Town whispering, Frank listening, Daniel holding papers. The walls have ears, and they are not on their side. As I set down my pen, I heard voices drifting from upstairs, Mara hissing, Caleb groaning. I caught one word clear as a bell: embarrassment. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about the neighbors, the bank, the town. That was the twist she hadn't planned for. They thought their power came from paper. But in a small town, reputation is the ink that never fades. And theirs was already smudging. By Friday morning, the air inside the house carried a different weight. Not mine, theirs. Fear makes a house louder. Mara's heels clicked harder on the wood floors. Caleb shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling, and their whispers cut off the second my cane tapped across the room. They thought I didn't notice, but silence has trained me to hear what people try to hide. At breakfast, Mara finally snapped. "Arthur," she said, her voice pitched louder than usual. "The neighbors are asking questions. Mrs. Jensen, Henry Wallace, even Tom at the hardware store. They're all whispering about you. Do you want them to think we're villains?" I stirred sugar into my coffee, slowly letting the spoon clink against the mug before I answered. "I don't have to make you look like anything, Mara. People see for themselves." Her cheeks flushed, and for a moment I thought she might slam her hand on the table. But she forced a brittle smile instead, her tone cutting even through its sweetness. "If you keep poisoning the town against us, Arthur, then maybe you really don't belong here." Caleb muttered Mara, as if trying to rein her in. His eyes flicked to me, tired, heavy. For once, he didn't back her words. I leaned back, cane across my lap, and looked directly at her. "You've already told them enough. Scheduling a notary before a conversation. Slipping Silver Pines brochures under my door. You think neighbors don't notice small towns keep receipts longer than banks?" Her smile cracked just slightly. "You're twisting everything." "No," I said, my voice steady. "I'm untwisting it." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Caleb rubbed his forehead, avoiding both our eyes. His spoon sat untouched in his cereal bowl, soggy flakes dissolving in milk. After breakfast, I stepped outside, letting the cool autumn air cut through me. Across the street, Henry Wallace was pruning his hedges. He looked up and gave me a nod, the kind men share when words aren't needed. But this time, words followed. "Arthur," he said, lowering his voice, "I overheard your son at the hardware store. Sounded upset talking about refinancing. He said, 'My father won't let go. He's making this impossible.'" Henry's eyes softened, not with pity, but with resolve. "You ever need a witness, Arthur, I'll stand by you. Folks around here trust me. They know I don't talk unless it matters." I gripped my cane tighter, my throat catching for a moment. "Thank you, Henry," I said. "I may take you up on that." Walking back into the house, I could feel Mara's eyes on me from the window, sharp as a blade. She knew I wasn't alone anymore. She knew the town was leaning and not in her direction. That night, as the house settled into its bones, I opened my green notebook and wrote, "Mara fears the town. Caleb is cracking. Henry crossed the line, now he's with me. They think they can control the story, but the story is already telling itself." The twist wasn't that I had spoken against them. The twist was that I didn't have to anymore. The town had chosen its side. The next morning, Mara cornered me in the kitchen. She stood with her arms crossed, her back pressed against the counter, and her smile stretched so tight it looked painful. "Arthur," she began, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "I think you've been talking too much in town. Mrs. Jensen asked me if we were putting you out. Can you imagine how embarrassing that is for us?" I set my coffee cup on the maple coaster I'd carved years ago and looked at her steadily. "Embarrassing for you," I said softly, but clarifying for everyone else. Her eyes flashed. "You're making us look like villains. Do you want people whispering about us behind our backs?" I leaned forward slightly, my cane planted firm against the tile. People whisper when there's something to whisper about. If you don't like what they're saying, Mara, maybe it's time to think about what you've done. Her jaw clenched, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the counter. Caleb walked in just then, crooked eyes still bleary from another restless night. He stopped when he saw the two of us locked in silence. "What's going on?" he asked. "Your father is poisoning the town against us," Mara snapped. I turned to Caleb. "I haven't said a word they didn't already notice for themselves. The town sees everything just like they saw me pour the footings for this house, and just like they'll see how you treat me now." Caleb's gaze faltered, and for the first time he didn't back her. Instead, he rubbed his forehead and muttered, "This is getting out of hand." Mara whirled on him. "Out of hand, Caleb. He's making us look like fools. If people keep talking, do you know what that does to us? To our standing, we'll be humiliated." Her voice rose higher with each word, and I noticed Caleb's shoulders tighten under the weight of it. He looked like a man caught between two fires, one burning with guilt and the other with pride. I said nothing. Silence has its own gravity. And in that silence, Mara's words sounded harsher, sharper, as though she were revealing more than she meant to. Finally, I spoke. "Respect isn't measured by what neighbors think of you. It's measured by how you treat the man who built the roof over your head." Caleb's eyes flicked to me, and for a brief moment, I saw the boy who once asked me if the Tigers would make the playoffs. The boy who believed I had all the answers. His mouth opened as if to speak, but Mara cut him off. "Arthur, you're twisting everything again. This is about making sure you're taken care of, not about some lean or reputation." I tapped my watch gently against the table. "Then why does every word out of your mouth sound like it's about control?" The room went still. Mara's face flushed red, but Caleb looked away, shame carving deep lines into his features. Later that night, I opened my green notebook and wrote, "Mara is panicking. Caleb is splitting. The louder she shouts, the clearer the cracks. Silence is not my weakness. It's the wedge between them." It was late when I heard the knock at my door. Not Mara's sharp, insistent tapping, but softer, hesitant. When I opened it, Caleb stood there, shoulders slumped, his tie-loosened eyes carrying the kind of heaviness that only shame can carve into a man. "Dad," he said quietly, "can I come in?" I nodded and stepped aside. He sat at Ruth's old desk, the same desk she had insisted we keep, because someday you'll want a place to write. He ran his hands across the surface, avoiding my eyes. "I didn't know Mara set up the notary," he said finally. His voice cracked low and unsteady. "I swear I didn't know until it was already in motion. I should have stopped it, but I didn't." I leaned on my cane, studying him. For a moment, he looked less like the man who had told me I had no meaning, and more like the boy who once came home crying because he had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball. Back then, he had begged me to fix it for him, and I'd told him the only way to fix a mistake was to knock on the door yourself and own it. "You forgot that lesson," I said softly. His head dropped into his hands. "I don't know what to do. Mara, she keeps saying it's for the best, that the house should be ours, that you'll be safer at Silver Pines. And He trailed off, his voice strangled by indecision. I rested a hand on the back of his chair. "Son, you don't take care of a father by pushing him out. You don't honor your mother's memory by treating her husband like a burden. If Mara's convinced you this is kindness, then you've forgotten what kindness really looks like." He looked up at me, then eyes, wet lips, trembling like he wanted to say something, but didn't have the strength. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered. "Then stop pushing," I said. "Sometimes the wisest thing a man can do is nothing. Let time do its work." He nodded faintly, but I saw the war raging behind his eyes. Mara's voice still echoed in his head, sharp and demanding, while mine had become quiet and steady. The question was which one would take root. Before he left the room, he turned back to me. "Dad, I'm sorry." His words were soft, almost swallowed by the silence, but they reached me. For a moment, I thought of the boy in the driveway with a glove too big for his hand, waving it in the air, begging me to play catch. That boy was still in there somewhere. After he closed the door, I sat at the desk and opened my green notebook. Tonight's entry was short. Caleb came to me. "Mara is losing her grip. The boy I raised is still alive beneath the man she's trying to shape. He's cracking, and through the cracks, light is getting in." The next morning, Mara's tone was different. Sharper, harder, as if she could sense the cracks forming in Caleb and meant to seal them with steel. She sat at the kitchen table when I came down, her legal pad, open, neat lines of notes written in her precise hand. Caleb wasn't there. "Arthur," she said crisply, "we need to revisit those papers. This time, let's be adults about it. No delays, no drama." I poured myself a cup of coffee, letting the silence stretch. "And Caleb?" I asked. Her lips thinned. "He's at work. He doesn't need to be involved in every decision. Some of this is better handled between us." That was her move, divide and isolate. I'd seen it before at the plant, when management tried to split men on the line. First, they separate you from your allies. Then they press. I sat at the table opposite her, cane resting against my knee. "You want me to sign over the house while my son isn't in the room?" Her smile was thin, but her eyes gleamed. "This isn't about him, Arthur. It's about your care, and frankly, your reputation. People are starting to talk. Mrs. Jensen, Tom, even Henry Wallace, do you want to be the old man everyone whispers about? The stubborn one dragging his family's name through the mud. I stirred sugar into my coffee slowly. Reputation cuts both ways. A man may be whispered about, but a couple who throws their father out, that doesn't stay secret long in a town like this. Her smile faltered. For the first time, I saw something harden in her expression, not just calculation, but desperation. Arthur, you're being unreasonable. This lien you're clinging to it won't last forever. Paperwork can be undone. Caleb and I will find a way. I set down the spoon and looked her dead in the eye. Paperwork doesn't fail. People do. Her face flushed red, her composure cracking. You can't stay here forever. One way or another, this house will be ours. I tapped my cane once on the floor, slow and deliberate. Long enough, I said. The kitchen fell into silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. For a moment, she looked like she might throw the cup in her hand. Instead, she stood abruptly, heels snapping against the tile as she stormed upstairs. I sipped my coffee unhurried. The storm was building in her. But storms rarely destroy the strongest trees, they just reveal which ones had shallow roots. Later, Caleb came home, his face pale and his steps heavy. He lingered at my door, not coming in, just standing there with his hand on the frame. "Dad," he said quietly, "this is getting ugly." I nodded, calm. That's what happens when people build their lives on lies. He swallowed hard, then walked away. That night I opened my green notebook and wrote, "Mara is desperate." She tried to corner me alone. She spoke of control, not care. Caleb sees it now. The storm isn't mine anymore, it's theirs. By the end of that week, whispers had turned into conversations. You can always tell when a town shifts, the smiles last longer. When you walk into a shop, the questions come slower, as though people already know the answer but want to hear it from your lips. At the post office, 2 women I barely knew approached me. One touched my arm gently and asked, "Arthur, is it true your son's trying to sell the house without you?" Her tone wasn't cruel. It carried something softer, almost protective. I didn't confirm, didn't deny. I simply said, "Sons forget. Sometimes fathers remember." Their faces darkened, and they walked off whispering to one another. By the time I left, I could feel every eye in line following me out the door. At the hardware store, Tom leaned across the counter. "Arthur, I heard Mara was sniffing around about fast listings. That true?" His voice carried that careful weight, the kind that says a man isn't gossiping, he's warning you. I nodded slightly. She's in a hurry, but haste has a way of tripping people who run too fast. Even at the bakery, Mrs. Jensen pressed another loaf into my hands, free this time. "Don't you worry, Arthur. Folks see what's happening. No one's blind." She glanced toward the window where Mara's car had just driven past and lowered her voice. "People don't like watching family thrown out like yesterday's trash. It won't sit well." By the time I returned home, the weight pressing on them was visible. Mara's smile was stretched so thin it looked painful, and Caleb's hands shook slightly as he fumbled with his tie. They could feel the walls tightening. They thought they had staged my erasure, but the town itself had become my witness. That evening, Mara tried to turn the story back. At dinner, she spoke loudly, her voice carrying through the open window. "Arthur, you've been confused lately. Caleb and I only want what's best for you. Silver Pines is a wonderful community. Everyone there says it feels like family." Her words were crafted for anyone passing by, designed to paint her as the caring daughter-in-law. But I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. Funny thing about family, Mara, it isn't brochures or contracts. It's standing by someone when it's hard. And everyone in this town knows the difference. Caleb's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Mara's face tightened, the mask cracking in the lamplight. For once, she had no rehearsed reply. Later that night, I sat at my desk, the green notebook open beneath my hand. I wrote, "The town has turned. They whisper, they nod, they stand beside me." Mara tried to twist the story, but her words sounded hollow. Caleb is breaking. The storm is no longer mine, it's theirs, and the town is watching every crack. As I set down the pen, I realized the twist wasn't that I had allies. It was that Mara and Caleb no longer had anywhere to hide. The first sign the tide was turning came not with shouting or slammed doors, but with a phone call. I was sitting at the table with my coffee, pretending to read the morning paper when Caleb's phone buzzed. He answered quickly, his voice clipped professional at first. But then 3 words broke through the quiet of the house. "What do you mean?" Denied. I didn't look up. I let the rustle of the newspaper mask my ears, catching every syllable. His free hand clenched and unclenched against his thigh, his jaw working as though he could chew the word into submission. Denied. Again, he said it softer this time, as if lowering his voice would change the meaning. Mara appeared in the doorway, eyes sharp. "What is it?" she hissed. Caleb turned his back, but I could still hear him. "The bank. They said it can't move forward." Something about an active lien. I folded the paper carefully and set it aside, taking a long sip of coffee. The taste was bitter metallic, but it steadied me. "Everything all right?" I asked lightly, as though I hadn't heard. Caleb spun, his face pale, the phone still pressed against his ear. "It's nothing," he snapped too quickly. "Nothing," I repeated, meeting his eyes. "Nothing has a way of making men sweat." His gaze faltered. Mara stepped forward, her smile brittle. "Arthur, don't concern yourself. It's just paperwork. These things happen." I tapped my watch gently against the coaster. "Paperwork," I said, "is more patient than people. That's why I keep it." Neither of them replied. Caleb ended the call abruptly and sank into a chair, his shoulders slumped. Mara's lips pressed thin, her eyes burning with questions she couldn't ask in front of me. The rest of the day passed with an uneasy quiet. Caleb left later than usual for work, muttering about meetings, while Mara stayed glued to her phone, pacing the kitchen tiles until her heels had worn a faint path into them. I said nothing. Patience is its own kind of pressure. You don't need to raise your voice when time and truth are squeezing your opponent. That evening, Caleb came home early. He didn't sit in the living room scrolling through his phone like he usually did. Instead, he walked straight to my room, his face tight with frustration. "Dad," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." I looked up from my notebook, calm. "We've been talking. You just haven't been listening." He took a step closer. "The bank said there's a lien from you from years ago. Why didn't you tell me?" I closed the notebook slowly. "Because you never asked." His mouth opened, then closed. For a long moment he stood there, his face working between anger and shame. Finally he muttered, "You've made it impossible for us to move forward." I met his eyes steadily. "What I've done is protect what's mine. What your mother and I built. What you forgot." The twist that night wasn't that he was angry, it was that he finally understood he wasn't in control. The house had chosen its witness, and it wasn't him. The day after Caleb's phone call, the house carried a brittle silence. You could hear it in the way Mara's heels struck the hardwood too sharply, in the way Caleb shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling, in the way their whispers died when my cane tapped across the floor. Fear has a sound, and it was echoing through my walls. By mid-morning, I stepped outside to clear my head. The autumn air cut sharp against my face, but it felt cleaner than the stale tension inside. Across the street, Henry Wallace stood by his hedge clippers. He gave me a nod before setting them aside. "Arthur," he said, lowering his voice. "I don't like meddling, but I heard Caleb yesterday at the hardware store. He was talking about refinancing Angry Loud. He said, 'My father's making this impossible.' Folks are talking." I studied him carefully. Henry wasn't a man who repeated gossip. When he spoke, it carried weight. "And what do they say?" I asked. He shrugged, uneasy. "Some say you're being stubborn. Others say your son's trying to push you out. People are picking sides, Arthur. And I'll tell you now, most are leaning your way. They know what you've done for this house." I gripped my cane, nodding slowly. "Thank you, Henry. That matters." By the time I walked home, Mara was waiting at the kitchen table, phone in her hand. She looked up, her smile tight as a wire. "Arthur," she said too sweetly, "the neighbors are asking questions. Do you want them to think we're cruel? Do you want to humiliate your own family?" I set my coffee cup on the coaster with deliberate calm. "I don't have to make you look cruel, Mara. You're doing that yourself." Her eyes flashed, her voice rising. "This lien, it won't last. Paper can be undone. Caleb and I will find a way." I leaned forward, my tone steady. "Paper doesn't fail. People do." Just then, Caleb walked in, his face drawn tight, his voice heavy. "The bank called again," he muttered. "They won't move forward until the lien is cleared." His eyes flicked to me, full of something between anger and recognition. "Why didn't you tell me?" I tapped the table gently with my cane. "Because you never asked." The silence was broken by a knock at the door. Mara froze, color draining from her face. Caleb stiffened, his jaw tight. I stood slowly and opened the door. There stood Frank, solid as the oak porch beams he once cut with his own hands. Beside him was Henry, hat in hand, his eyes steady, and with them a man in a gray suit from the bank folder tucked neatly under his arm. "Morning," Frank said, stepping inside without hesitation. "Figured we should all sit down." Mara's eyes went wide, her lips parting as if she had just seen the walls close in around her. Caleb paled. The banker cleared his throat. "We need to clarify some things," he said firmly. The twist was clear. The battle was no longer private. My house had turned into a courtroom, and the verdict was about to be read. The living room felt smaller, with 3 men standing inside Frank, steady as oak Henry with his hat in hand, and the banker adjusting his gray suit as though he carried the weight of the law in his folder. Mara stayed rooted near the dining table, her nails biting into the edge of a chair. Caleb hovered beside her, pale and restless, his eyes flicking from me to the folder as if it were a live wire. The banker cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed," he said, looking at me first, "your lien is valid and enforceable. Until it's resolved, no sale, refinance, or transfer of this property can proceed. Legally, the property cannot change hands without your signature." He paused, then glanced toward Caleb and Mara. "And based on our records, Mr. Reed has given no indication he intends to sign anything." Caleb's shoulders sagged as though the strings holding him upright had been cut. Mara's face drained of color, then flared red. "This is outrageous," she hissed. "You can't just show up here and humiliate us in our own home." I leaned lightly on my cane, steady. "I didn't ask them to come. Truth has a way of walking through the door on its own." Henry stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Arthur's been part of this town longer than any of us. Folks see what's happening. They don't like it." He looked directly at Mara, his eyes hardening. "And they're not fooled." Mara opened her mouth to retort, but no words came. Her polished smile, the mask she wore so carefully, cracked in front of witnesses. Her breathing grew shallow, her fists tightening at her sides. Frank crossed his arms. Arthur doesn't need to fight this battle by shouting. He's got the law, the town, and friends who won't stand by while you try to erase him. That's more than enough. Caleb sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Mara turned on him sharply. You said this would be simple. You said he'd fold. Her voice dripped with venom. Now look at us, everyone laughing, everyone judging. Her words echoed down the hall, sharp enough to slice through whatever pride Caleb had left. His face crumpled, shame carving deep lines where arrogance had once been. For a moment, I saw the boy who had once waved a baseball glove too big for his hand, begging me to play catch. But now that boy was buried under the weight of a woman's fury and his own choices. The banker closed his folder with finality. That's all I needed to clarify. Unless Mr. Reed chooses otherwise, nothing moves forward. He gave me a respectful nod before heading out the door. Henry tipped his hat, his promise silent but steady. Frank lingered just long enough to meet my eyes, giving a small nod that carried more weight than a speech. When the door closed and the house fell silent again, Mara stood rigid, her eyes blazing with a hatred she no longer tried to hide. Caleb sat broken beside her, his hands covering a face that once looked so much like mine. The twist was undeniable. The fight was no longer within these walls. It had spilled into the town, the bank, and the law. And every witness had chosen me. The house was quiet after the banker, Frank, and Henry left, but it wasn't the same silence I had lived with for weeks. This was heavier, like dust settling after a demolition. Mara stood stiff by the table, fists clenched, her eyes burning holes into me. Caleb sat hunched in a chair, his face buried in his hands. The notary, the papers, the whispered calls, it all lay in ruins around them, and they knew it. I leaned on my cane, steady, and let the silence stretch until it pressed down on both of them. Then I spoke, not with anger, but with the weight of truth. You said I had no meaning in this house anymore. But it seems the house disagrees. It remembers who poured its foundation, who fixed its leaks, who carved its coasters. Meaning doesn't vanish because someone is impatient. Caleb lifted his head slowly, his eyes red, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Mara turned on him, her voice sharp as broken glass. This is your fault. You promised me he'd sign. You promised this would be simple. Her words echoed through the room louder than any slam of a door. Caleb flinched, as though each word struck him. His hands trembled. Mara, enough, he muttered. Enough, she snapped. Do you see what we look like? The neighbors are laughing at us. The bank humiliated us. She jabbed a finger toward me, turned this entire town against us. And you just sit there. Her fury hung in the air like smoke. Caleb's shoulders sagged further. I tapped my cane once against the floor, steady, deliberate. You see, Mara, I said quietly, this was never about the neighbors. It wasn't even about the house. It was about respect. And respect isn't stolen with paperwork. It's earned through every small act, every quiet sacrifice. Her face twisted, but she had no reply. Caleb stared at the floor, shame carving deep grooves into his expression. I turned toward him. Son, you take care of me by not taking from me. You take care of me by asking before deciding. You take care of me by remembering that meaning isn't measured in rent or speed or noise, it's measured in love. And love doesn't evict. For a moment, the only sound was the tick of my watch on the table, steady as a heartbeat. Caleb looked at me, then truly looked as if seeing me for the first time in years. His lips trembled. Dad, he whispered. I don't know how to fix this. You start, I said, by remembering who built the table you sit at. Mara exhaled sharply, turning her back, fury radiating off her like heat from a fire. But Caleb stayed where he was, hunched and broken, caught between the man he had become and the boy he used to be. The twist wasn't in my words, it was in his silence. For the first time, he didn't defend her. He didn't defend himself. He just listened. And in listening, he revealed the truth. The foundation beneath them was no longer hers, and it was no longer his. It was mine. The morning after the confrontation, the sky outside was gray, the kind of gray that seeps into walls and bones alike. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee cane resting against my leg, while Mara paced the living room, her phone pressed so tightly to her ear, it looked as though she meant to crush it. Her voice was sharp, brittle. Yes, I understand. But the lien can't last forever. He's old. He'll give in. Just hold the buyer a little longer. She didn't see me standing in the doorway. Or maybe she did and didn't care. Caleb shuffled in a few minutes later, face pale, tie knotted too tight. He muttered something about a meeting, but lingered, hovering like a man waiting for permission. Mara turned and hissed, "This is your mess, Caleb. Fix it." I stepped forward, my voice calm. The bank already fixed it, and they weren't fixing it for you. Both of them froze. Mara's face flushed. Caleb's eyes dropped to the floor. I took my seat again, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. Silence has always been my sharpest blade. Just then, another knock came at the door. This time, Caleb moved slowly to answer it, like a man approaching the gallows. Standing there was Frank, with Henry right behind him, and the banker, again, folder tucked neatly beneath his arm. Mara stiffened. Caleb muttered, "Not again." The banker spoke first, his voice firm. "Mr. Reed's lien is still valid, and until he decides otherwise, nothing moves forward. That means no listing, no refinancing, no sale." He looked directly at me. "The choice rests entirely with you." Mara's mask finally shattered. "This is humiliating," she spat. "We can't live like this. He's ruining us." I rose, slowly leaning on my cane, my watch ticking steady at my wrist. "No, Mara. You ruined yourselves the moment you mistook control for care. You tried to erase me with paper, but paper remembers, and so does this town." Frank crossed his arms, his voice low but final. "Arthur doesn't stand alone. Not here." Henry tipped his hat. "If you ever need a witness, Arthur, you've got one." The banker closed his folder. "That settles it." He gave me a respectful nod, then turned to leave. Frank and Henry followed, but not before Frank gave me a small, knowing look, the kind that carries more weight than 1,000 words. When the door shut behind them, the silence left in its place was deafening. Mara stood rigid, her fury written across every line of her face. Caleb sat slumped, broken, staring at the table where the folder of their failed plans still lay. I tapped my cane once against the floor. "You said I had no meaning in this house, but meaning doesn't vanish when whispered away by impatience. It stands, it endures, and today it outlasted you." I turned and climbed the stairs, each step slow but steady. At the top, I looked back once. Caleb's eyes met mine, wet and desperate, but he said nothing. Mara glared at him, her fists clenched, her voice caught in her throat. Back in my room, I sat at Ruth's desk and opened my green notebook. Today's entry was simple. The storm broke. Caleb crumbled. Mara raged. The house held and I remained. The twist was never in their plan. The twist was in mine, quiet, patient, deliberate. They thought I had no meaning. But meaning was the very foundation beneath their feet, and it was mine all along. When the dust settled, I realized something Ruth had always tried to teach me. Storms don't just destroy, they reveal. They show you which trees have shallow roots and which ones can endure the wind. Caleb and Mara tried to measure my worth in signatures, bank accounts, and silence. But meaning isn't erased by paper. Meaning is in the foundations you pour, the sacrifices you make, the love you give when no one is looking. For weeks they believed my quiet meant surrender. What they never understood was that silence is not weakness, it's strategy. I didn't have to shout to prove my place in this house. The town saw, the law saw, and eventually even Caleb saw. Respect is cheaper than war, but when respect is denied, truth has a way of writing itself back into the story. And so I remained, not because I fought with fists, but because I stood with patience, memory, and the kind of dignity no one can take. If you're listening to this, remember, family is not about control, it's about care. And if you are a parent or child thinking of pushing someone out of your life for convenience, stop and ask yourself if the reflection you'll see years from now will be one you can live with. Have you ever faced a moment like mine where family tried to erase your meaning? How did you handle it? What did you learn? Share your story in the comments. If this touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for listening.